shall I start? What do you think? There is a little bit of background noise. But, can you all hear me okay? I'm not very much used to speaking to a microphone because I'm being a TV star. I need to do that. So thank you for showing up for this. I'm going to talk about auditing research and some opportunities in Europe. Now, I think the time that has been allocated to us, we run up to 12:30, am I right? Now, there are roughly two parts. The second part is about opportunities of research in Europe. If I do not get there in good time, maybe somebody can volunteer to tell me, Alex, can I ask you, when we get to, if I get to 12:10 and I have not started talking about opportunities of research in Europe, give me the sign, okay? Thank you. So, auditing research is pretty extensive, and I want to talk about a particular dimension, and I may argue a relatively, perhaps, narrow dimension, but it is reflecting definitely my kind of personal interest and taste, which is about the issue of auditor independence. Can I just have a feel for how many of you are doing or thinking of, how many of you have been already been engaged in auditing related research? Can I have show of hands? Okay, thank you. And some are just contemplating or just want to okay. Don't stay quiet. You can ask me questions as we go along. Okay? So I rather it is interactive. Some of you who are already faculty would know, and those of you who are not faculty would know in the future, would know, that the last thing you want as a teacher is that everybody is quiet. Okay? And the last thing in a seminar you present, you want people not to ask questions. So I rather cover less, but have some interaction and take some questions. So please do interact, okay? So a little bit about what I want to do, and you will note the bottom line, the bullet point where I want you to ask questions. So I'm into this, what is called archival auditing research. And I'm going to speak about how perhaps we can define auditor independence, and then we'll go into the research, talking about how the literature has dealt with the issue of auditor independence and economic, it's called economic bonding. I'll go through several papers, again, a very selective set of papers that I've chosen, I've been reading and been interested in. It is not to say that this is the entire universe of papers in this topic. And the second part, so to speak, would be what is happening in Europe, concluding perhaps with some ideas about research in Europe. I take that most of you are European-based. Can I have show of hands of how many people are based in Europe? So, it's the right plan. Okay, so you can think about the real world and what we do as researchers. Okay, so the real world, we can speak broadly on certain inputs that you have on the left top box. So, you know, inputs into the audit process, some are kind of, if you will, mental or otherwise, you know, more physical perhaps inputs like the auditor independence, the effort that the auditors put into the process, the expertise and knowledge they bring to the table, how well the client does or does not cooperate. So there is a list of factors, not by the way meant to be exhaustive, but list of things that, inputs that take place in the real world, and there are some, if you will, real puts, well, we have the auditor opinion. The auditor writes a report, and we can see it in the financial statements, where they say whether the financial statements are presented according to the rules, or give a true and fair view, if you will. This is more European concept, and not so much American concept, the true and fair view. And perhaps more broadly, we have the reporting quality. But how we, as researchers, how we operationalize these inputs or these kind of concepts, inputs and outputs, how do we relate to them in research? So let's say that you want to find how auditor independence affects, say, the reporting quality. Okay? You need to come up with measures of auditor independence, and you need to come up with measures of reporting quality. So I drew a few arrows, if you will. Let's say that fees represent something. Fees may represent, according to some school of thought, audit effort. According to another school of thought, fees may represent what we call economic bonding. So there is a little bit of a question mark about what fees, or sometimes abnormal fees, represent, but we can perhaps link, if we have some strong belief or theory about what fees represent, relate them to an outcome that we see, which is the auditor opinion, whether the pass or fail, if you will, whether there are any qualifications, any going concern opinion, or things like that. Okay, so this is one possible link. Or you can take fees, and I mention fees because many of the papers I'm going to show you will focus on fees. Measure of reporting quality. What would be measures of reporting quality, you think? How can we measure reporting quality? Or how do we measure reporting quality? Any ideas? So maybe accruals, or abnormal accruals, or conservatism, or any other measure that you can come up for reporting quality. And so the literature has, not necessarily literature in auditing, but the literature has come up with various measures of reporting quality. So you can associate fees with these kinds of measures. Or you can look at the question of, perhaps again, if you think about auditor independence, the question is it good to have long-serving auditors? Is it a fair question? Is it good to have long-serving auditors? And you may take a position that long-serving auditors is bad because they become they form too cozy, friendly relationship with the subject matter, the ones that they look at or investigate or need to monitor, if you will. Maybe long tenure is good because they gain through and over time lots of know-how, expertise, firm specific. Okay, so you can associate it with measures of reporting quality or even the outcome, whether it is clean, qualified opinion. So I drew here only several connections, but you could, of course, have many more arrows here. Okay, so these kind of the things just to give you some feel for taste for what I want to talk about. So what is audit quality? Sometimes we have perhaps kind of good gut feel about it, but it's very hard to verbalize it. Okay, so what is good? What is audit quality? I think it is hard to define it. It is hard to verbalize, and I will present you with several definitions. So there is quite an interesting and useful paper. If you have not come across yet, perhaps you should. It's a review paper in JE 2014 by Mark Lefond and Zhang. And there, for example, they define audit quality as greater assurance of high reporting quality. So we need to operationalize what is higher reporting quality and what is meant by greater assurance. So even if you put forward some definitions, sometimes it is not really clear what it actually means. D'Angelo, which goes back, D'Angelo is one of the first kind of auditing research papers, I would say, at least archival. It is defined, the audit quality is defined as market assessment, I should look here, market assess joint probability that a given auditor will both detect a breach and report the breach. So is it perhaps a too narrow definition of the auditor's work? I mean, things that we have today suggest so. Audit quality and independence are intertwined. The supply of audit quality is affected by auditor incentives for independence, again, for the same paper. So kind of various definitions that kind of dance around without kind of giving us a clear idea. Some professional bodies or regulators also have put forward some definitions. I will not read all of them to you. You could do it yourself. But if you look here, the SEC says an auditor is not independent, so it's kind of negating what is independent. Is not independent if a reasonable investor with knowledge of all relevant facts and circumstances would conclude that the auditor is not capable of exercising objective and impartial judgment. So basically, the SEC says if we took you to court, we'll ask the juries or somebody, other human beings, to decide whether you would be independent or not. Again, it is very hard to operationalize it, and that is a challenge for us as researchers. The international ethics standard boards also put some stuff forward. There is some overlap between the various definitions, but I think the point that I want to put forward to you, without going through reading these various definitions, is that each body or each one who entity that puts forward such a definition, they choose different ways to define it, and it's not always useful. So, I've been, as I mentioned before, I've been interested in auditor independence from the economic standpoint. That is, the basic tension is that the auditor is supposed to represent the shareholders and look at the reporting choices and the accounting systems that basically are under the control of the managers, and the managers actually pay them. So, you would feel that if one is paid by the same person that they need to monitor, that creates a little bit of tension. Would you agree with that? Because ultimately, if the auditor falls out with the managers, if the managers and the auditors clash, what would be the ultimate consequence? Typically, it's that the auditor would leave, not the manager. Okay? So they need to kind of keep good relationships with the managers. And the tension is that maybe that would compromise their independence. And the economic bonding in particular, because we're talking about the fees, is that the manager may also, and I qualify what I'm saying now is I put it in a very simple English, and perhaps it's not something that you write in a paper, but essentially you could say that if the manager wants to achieve a particular accounting outcome or reporting outcome, they can bribe, and this is a very strong word, okay? So we don't put it in papers, we don't say the managers bribe the auditors, but you could say in plain English, in a very intuitive way, hey, I would pay you a little bit more, but you can think of you don't give me a hard time, okay? And since we don't want to conflict as an auditor, you don't want to conflict too much with the manager, you are taking, again, strong word, you're taking the bribe and you shut up your eyes to whatever problem you have identified. Okay? So that is a possibility. Would you agree with that? Okay, you're very quiet. Please, if you have questions or comments, please. So this is the bribe kind of perspective. But in honesty, it could be that many companies, or at least some companies, would like to pay the auditors higher fees, not because really they want to bribe them, but because they are genuinely interested in improving the audit process and audit quality, whatever way you define audit quality. They want to, auditors perhaps spend more time, give more valuable input, put more resources into the audit process, and if this takes more money, so be it. So that is also a possibility that we need to take into account. Of course, when we look at audit fees, it could be something else altogether. It could be that certain clients are more risky, so regardless of the amount of effort you put in, you still want to insure yourself as an auditor against the possibility that something eventually will be revealed that is wrong and you may be taken to court. And so the client risk, which is associated with audit risk. So how do we measure the independence or effort, if you will, from fees? One approach would be take only audit fees. Okay, so you may know, of course, that there are two types of fees, so to speak, which is the audit fee and the non-audit fee. So the non-audit fee is the fee paid for other services, other meaning non-audit services, which could be perhaps tax services or some IT services. By the way, some of which have been now disallowed, but generally speaking, or generically speaking, non-audit fees refers to other services that have been or used to be provided by the audit. So typically what we take is not the absolute number, but we take some transformation. Some would perhaps scale the audit fees by sales or by total assets, but it is pretty common that we take the log transformation of fees. Some would take the sum of audit and non-audit fees. Something that I don't think has been explored very well is that though companies report separately audit and non-audit fees, we don't really know how credible this internal classification is. Maybe, and again I'm using a very strong word, and just take it like that, and you would not write it in a paper, maybe they misrepresent or cheat on this classification because it is convenient to them for whatever reason. So you may want perhaps to take total fees rather than focus on just one of them. But of course, if you believe that the classification, the reported audit fee is a good measure and you are interested in, say, audit effort or perhaps bribes through audit fees, maybe you just take the audit fee measure and ignore non-audit fees. But there has been lots of research on non-audit fees because that is a natural way perhaps to bribe, and again, take always bribe is a very strong word that creates some economic bond, because the story is we'll pay the auditor to do some other, importantly, more lucrative work, and because it is very lucrative, the auditor would want to carry on doing this work, and so they will compromise on the audit effort stuff. That is the story, I think. But some would say that audit fees may, with the raw number or even after the log transformation, represents lots of stuff. And so you want to assess what is the normal level of fees for a particular company and year. So maybe a company that is larger, we would expect that there will be higher audit fees. not necessarily that we see higher audit fees means something bad. It is because if you could take two companies, one is larger, maybe more complex, maybe has more property plant equipment, maybe it has more receivables, maybe this, maybe that. Okay, so what you want, therefore, to do is come up with a measure that says, okay, this is normal and this is abnormal, this is unusual. And take the unusual or the unexpected measure, and I'll show you how the literature did it. Take this as a measure, say, if you believe that this abnormal measure represents abnormal audit effort, something good, okay, that is a good measure. Or if you think it is a measure of the economic bond, maybe you use it as the economic bond. Okay, so it is something kind of abnormal. Okay, so typically, and I'm going to show you this, it is a statistical approach to what is abnormal audit fee, in the sense that we are going to run a regression model where we have the fee as the dependent variable and a variety of other variables, maybe even a large number of independent or explanatory variables, trying to capture various aspects of the audit process, and then the residual would be this abnormal. Of course, remember that the residual from an RLS sums up to, in the cross-section, if you add up all residuals across all observations, what would you get? It's zero, isn't it? So some would be positive, and some would be negative, and then you need to put some interpretation about what is a positive abnormal fee and what is a negative abnormal fee, which is another challenge for us as researchers. Okay? But on average, there will be zero. Okay? So, of course, the question is, as I say, what is this residual? What does it represent? You can perhaps adopt a different approach whereby you take some fee ratios like non-audit fees to total fees or audit fees to total fees. So, a variety of approaches. Alex?
Fees also trying to capture an economic construct that you don't observe the auditor's effort. Is there a way for us to improve research and actually look at number of hours that is spent, the chargeable hours, to get this one direct
Yeah.
effort?
So ideally, you're absolutely right. Perhaps a better construct would be a number of hours. Problem is that it is not typically observable. I have one slide which I mentioned a paper that was done by Angela and some others. Angela is my ex-PhD student, and she works here at Bocconi. And she got access to unique proprietary data which does have audit hours. But you don't have many such papers. So indeed, this is a problem with these measures, yeah? And perhaps if you can get access to companies that will provide you audit hours or some other measure, more direct measure of effort, that will be very good. Okay, so here is a typical regression that you may find in any of these archival auditing research, and my latest count is that there were some 22 explanatory variables. 22 explanatory variables. It's almost, you can say, it's a put anything you could think of. Some label it as a kitchen sink approach. You throw in whatever. But for example, just to illustrate, it's not completely whimsical, it's not completely random. The size of the company, whether it has foreign operations, which means perhaps the auditor's task is more complicated, the profitability, the receivables and inventory that they need to look at. If you don't have inventory, maybe less effort. And a variety of some other things, including risk of litigation, number of employees, special items, you name it. Okay, so you have some more parsimonious models, some longer models, but essentially what we're trying to control for everything that would give rise to normal fees, and so the residual, which is the epsilon, represents the abnormal fees. So I'll give you now a selective literature review. My selection. Okay? So don't take it to say this is everything that has been written on the topic. Okay, so in some of the cases I'll go deeper into one or two of the papers. So the way I organize this table is as follows. So here I selected at least in this page you have 3 papers. 2 papers from early 2000, one more recent, and this part tells you about the period, which is the P, the sample size, and the country or jurisdiction. So just to illustrate to you, the reason I do it is to illustrate to you that one challenge we have when we look at these results is that they are not strictly comparable all the time, okay, because there are differences in the sample in terms of period and size and jurisdiction. So the first one, Cresswell et al., took 2 years, 1994 and 1996, and they have these figures in number of observations. And here you have it was done in Australia. The other 2 studies were done in the US, but the Fond et al., for example, is only 1 year. The Blay et al., more recent, looks at the longer period. And this is particularly post-SOX. Everybody knows what SOX is? Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Is there anybody here who does not know what Sarbanes-Oxley? Not everybody always knows what Sarbanes-Oxley is. Of course, those who do auditing do know. So the question is, what is the relation between audit fees, fees, and generally speaking, and the outcome would be the opinion, maybe qualified opinion, going concern opinion, and so on. So what do you see here is that the fee measure that they use, and I don't want to read to you each cell or each box here, but if you just review it, you can see that the fee measures that they are using are not the same. Is it fair to characterize it like that, that it is not the same measure being used all across these ones? And the outcome is kind of 2 papers have the going concern, but 1 paper has qualified opinion. So what is the conclusion here? Fees are not associated with the occurrence of qualified opinion, so from this you conclude that economic bond is not a major issue. And the second one reaches the same conclusion. But here the last one reaches a different conclusion. So I want now to talk a little bit about the third one, okay, which is more recent and reported in CAR, Contemporary Accounting Research. So here's the question. So normally people would associate current fees to be contemporaneous. That is to say, let's look at, say, current fees or current abnormal fees with some outcome which is dependent variable, let's say abnormal accrual or some other measure that we have in mind. But these guys say, well, maybe the implicit contract between the auditors and the client is as follows. We'll keep quiet today, okay? We'll do whatever you want today, and in the future you will reward us. Okay, sounds sensible? So what they do, therefore, they take not a measure of current abnormal fees or current measure of fees or economic bond, but the future. They look at the future, okay? And they say, okay, let's see how future fees affect today's opinion. So this is why I highlighted this one. And remember, they found that somewhat different results than before. So the objective, the stated objective, in this study we assess the potential impairment of auditor independence in the context of going concern reporting by examining the association between both current and future audit service and non-audit service fees received by US auditors and the type of opinion rendered by financially distressed clients. So they are looking at a particular sample, which is distressed clients, not everybody. So that may also be of importance. And also note the careful language being used here. They do not speak about causality, for example. I hope you all recognize that they don't speak about causality. They speak about association. We need, of course, to ask ourselves, is it enough? Is it satisfactory enough? And so the results are presented to you here, and basically they say, well, if the auditor is going to be paid higher fees in the future, they will collaborate with the distressed clients now, and so will not issue any opinion that is problematic. And so they expect a negative side. Okay. And so, essentially, you may say that they kind of find it at least in this specification. But let's review the results a little bit. So current audit fees and total fees do not seem to constitute a bribe, but not clear if they represent audit effort either. So, for example, if you take current total fees, the p-value is insignificant. Okay, so it is maybe not bribe, but it is not effort either. Okay. Future fees, yes, the auditor is rewarded in the future if they compromise today. But maybe this in distress fees become under pressure and rebound when the client's financial position improves. So what this point tries to tell you that the question is, how do you interpret the results? Okay? Sometimes the authors put forward, and we are all guilty of that, so it's not that I choose to pick on them. People could criticize my work as well. But authors sometimes often take a particular view and not always consider some other interpretations that could fit the results. And I would think that the results are somewhat counterintuitive. Wouldn't we expect auditors in distress periods to be less amenable to economic bond as legal threat and reputational risks are stronger? So if people are going to look at auditors, in particular they're going to look at how auditors perform in problematic companies. So they are under scrutiny. So are they going to expose themselves to this? So it's kind of questionable. Why did they select only such a short period of time? Why not more? Alex?
I don't know. Do you know how we treat the sample selection issues here? Because in order to measure future fees, the auditor needs to be the same. And if things get fishy, then an auditor needs to drop the contract.
So I don't know whether I would not even remember, didn't claim to remember, but so the question is whether they control for auditor switch or not, and how many auditor switches we have in the first place. Yeah, so selection bias could play a role, and then the question is, and I cannot answer this, we'll have both to look at the paper to answer it, but these are matters that in fact a careful researcher has to consider. So reporting quality is another outcome that people have tried to relate to audit fees and the bribe or effort kind of question. Okay, so again, 3 papers, maybe here I have a little bit more, but if you look at this, and I think I provided the slides before, and I don't know if you have access to these slides. You will have access to these slides. But again, the message that I want to convey from here is that different papers or different researchers selected different measures, different sample sizes, different periods, and some go, if you will, the state of affairs right now. Many papers still refer to some so-called seminal papers, which I listed here, like the Frankel et al. And Ashmore et al. But you cannot really, in good scientific faith, rely only on one-year results. But many people still kind of relate to them. But that is a little bit of a side comment. So again, different approaches to different measures, and so this one concludes non-audit fees. So here they look at non-audit fees. Let me step back a little bit and explain to you why this paper that was published in 2002 focuses on non-audit fees. That was after the Enron thing, and many accounting researchers were particularly concerned because legislators, the SEC and the public, if you will, were under the impression at that time that non-audit fees is the culprit. Because non-audit fees, as I mentioned before, were particularly very lucrative. That was the channel through which auditors were bribed. Okay? And so that is the reason why we see that at least earlier research tended to focus a lot on non-audit fees. There is less such emphasis nowadays because non-audit fees have been, at least in the US and now also in Europe, being kind of regulated out of businesses, essentially. So, Frankel et al. Non-audit fees are associated with earnings management, so they look at, say, abnormal accruals, but audit fees are negatively related to earnings management. So, non-audit fees are the bad guys, the audit fees are the good guys. This one, non-audit fees are not associated with earnings management. Mixed evidence about audit fees in earnings management. So again, you see different papers come with different approaches. Gould et al. Okay, this is again about the same era, but still note 1 year. This is 1993. Positive abnormal accruals associated with higher audit fees. Not good. That means maybe bribe. Okay. So aggressive earnings management is acceptable when clients pay large fees. What do we infer from this? The bribe story. These guys find that the Lark and Richardson fee ratios, not abnormal fees, not raw fees, fee ratios are negatively related to earnings management. This is inconsistent with economic bonding. And Scholli et al. Find that pre-SOX, the promise of more non-audit service work impairs independence, as is seen from the positive sign on interaction term, positive SOX, and post-SOX, I'm sorry, no relation. So, how are we doing time? So let me try to talk about this last one, the Scholli, maybe I'm pronouncing it correctly, I'm not sure. So they expand on the idea that the cooperation, the collusion, if you will, in the current period buys higher fees in the future, and we saw one example before. And so they examine fees at the same city and industry in an attempt to capture partner-level fees. The partner identity is, or at least was not known at the time in the US. And so the main variables of interest, please remember this for make a mental note of this, is the opportunity for fees to grow in the future. It is essentially an indicator for currently low fees. So if we observe low fees now, there is lots of potential for them to grow in the future. This is the actual realized change in non-audit fees. Again, note the focus on non-audit fees. And if you track these two variables, it is the cases where there was potential to grow, and it has been materialized. And so they use a particular approach to calculating abnormal accruals or abnormal abnormal cow. And of course, again, there are various measures of abnormal accruals, so these more that the literature has agreed on a single unified measure of abnormal accruals. And then what they take these abnormal accrual measures and they kind of interested in this one. So to remind you, basically they asked themselves if fees could grow in the future, and they did grow a lot in the future, that is where perhaps we will find tension, whereas the auditor agreed to compromise on independence in return for future higher fees. Okay, and so what they find is indeed this is kind of positive pre-SOX and not so much post-SOX. So if you are interested, say, like I am, in the pre-post SOX analysis, whether SOX has worked or not, that suggests that there was a problem before SOX. You see the positive coefficient, and there is no such problem after SOX. Hooray, hooray! SOX wasn't very good. Okay. So the authors focus on the positive coefficient, on the interaction term that I mentioned. This supports the notion of economic bonding, but only pre-SOX. But if you look at the other coefficients, they are kind of more kind of difficult to interpret. So the negative coefficient on either, so let's see, I think we have here this negative coefficient, and also here. The negative coefficient on either the opportunity for fees to grow or the actual percentage they grew is baffling. The authors simply say this result is consistent with the view that non-audit services, NAS, non-audit services, do not always negatively influence audit quality, which is a little bit of a, waving your hands in the air and without providing, very good explanation. Audit tenure. Now, in Europe in particular, audit tenure, you see, is important because we had requirements to, and not also that is true for in the US, to, but after SOX, to replace the audit partner, to rotate routinely the audit partner, and the, so it varies from country to country. I think in the UK it's 5 years, I think here in Italy 6 years. I think for the partner is 6, for the company is 9 years. In Italy there is a particular specific interesting regulatory environment where both the partner and the firm need to change. But in many other countries, it is restricted to partner change. And people were interested in the auditor tenure for the reason I mentioned before, because if long tenure is bad, whatever way you define bad, then we want to rotate the auditor. Yeah? And so many regulators basically took this approach. They had the conception that long audit tenure is not good, is counterproductive when it comes to auditor independence. Okay, and we see these rules that require rotation. But what does the evidence show? So again, I throw at you several papers. It's not an exhaustive list. And again, the message that I'm trying to put forward to you is that you take, these papers that are normally highly cited, and you see they were done in different periods, different methodologies, different samples, and so on and so forth. Here it is the several things here. The first two look at going concern, okay, but also the abnormal accrual. So the first paper here is strong positive association of short tenure with absolute abnormal accruals for short tenure. And what do you conclude from that? So it's not that the long tenure, if you take just the results of this paper, it's not that the long tenure is problematic. It is the short tenure that is problematic. Would you agree with my interpretation? So strong positive, short tenure with abnormal, absolute abnormal accruals. So you take the absolute, the absolute is the magnitude of abnormal accruals, whether it is negative or positive, doesn't matter. It's sign neutral. And when the tenure is short, say within 3 years, you find that these absolute abnormal accruals are larger, which suggests more discretion is taking place. And if you believe that more discretion is bad, then short tenures are bad. Now, what could explain this? In fact, that goes contrary to what regulators had in mind. Well, when you just start the job, you don't know the audit client very well, you tend to make more mistakes. Okay? So in fact, it is a counter-argument for rotation. Take the second one, the probability of going concerns increases with tenure. If anything, the auditors highlight problems more frequently if they serve as auditors longer times. Again, this does not sit very well with the notion that long tenure is problematic. Now, I'll just put here kind of a side comment that when SOX was considered in Congress, or by, if you also take it to other political decisions, politicians don't always want to look at the evidence. They have certain agenda, political agenda. Okay? So they will not let good evidence to stand in the way. Okay? And so SOX went forward, even though there was no evidence really put to them that there is a problem. Glenn.
I want to suggest a hypothesis that maybe there's a sweet spot. So in a short-term tenure, that partner who got that audit has all these bragging rights. Oh boy, I got this company as an audit. And the client knows that. It can put that person under a lot of pressure because obviously they don't want to lose the audit in year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there may be a lot of pressure. There was a case many years ago in Florida when a new partner, the same firm, but when a new partner started the audit, they just sat him down and said, we've been cheating all these years. They made a market in federal bonds, I think it was. It was one of the biggest companies.
I'm not familiar, so I'm learning again.
Yeah. Anyways, the point was that they set the partner down and said, you're the youngest partner in your company. And we're telling you, we've been falsifying this data forever. You want to be the one who gets in trouble for this. And so he went along.
Yeah.
So
the other view that I hear also is that when they select a partner, they select a partner that would collaborate.
Right. So maybe there might be a sweet spot. But,
Yeah.
the first 5 years, you're like on probation. And you got to be very, very careful. You being the auditor, because you don't want to lose the audit.
Then you gain confidence and you allow yourself to issue. Absolutely. Yeah, it could be.
Just high cost.
Yeah, it could be. But either way, the question is whether this changes the conclusion that long tenures are bad or good. I don't know. The third one says auditors appear to place greater constraints on both income increasing and income decreasing accruals as the auditor-client relationship lengthens. So again, there is no problem with long tenure. There is a problem with short ones. Reporting quality and audit tenure. The evidence in the previous slide seems to suggest that long tenure is good, at least from these measures. But there is some conflicting evidence elsewhere to some extent, and I list it here. So it is not always true, but I think overall it would be fair to say that even if you go outside the US, and here is a European-based, in Belgium in particular, that finds a similar approach. So I think, Alex, you don't need to give me the sign because we know, but thank you anyway. Now I want to talk about something that perhaps would be very relevant to you if you consider conducting research, and in particular, auditing research, and in particular, perhaps trying to take advantage of the European landscape. Okay, so it's not meant to US-based, it's meant to everybody, but in particular those who work within or in Europe and so perhaps have a better feel for the institutional setup, which is very, very important. Okay. So lots of changes taking place in Europe, not entirely without synchronization with the US, but nonetheless we have lots of changes taking place, and some advantages to European data that I'm going to highlight. So partner rotations that we have since 2006. Now we have, and this is unlike the US, requirement for field level rotation. Every 10 years with a tender perhaps could be extended to 20 years. There are some restrictions not entirely similar to the US about non-audit services, but also the restrictions it is important to state that the restrictions in Europe about non-audit services came into force much later than in the US. But it's slightly different. Something that I'm particularly excited about, which is very recent, there is a requirement, it is also an international and recent requirement for the new auditor report. How many of you know that nowadays the auditor report has changed? Okay, just a handful of. So it used to be a one page, sometimes even not one page, where the auditor would give, we call it a pass-fail opinion. Either there is a problem or there is no problem, so it's a clean opinion. But there has been some demand by investors and shareholders to better understand the audit process. And so, after a lengthy consultation period, there is an international standard, but also you see it in the US and more importantly in the UK. The auditor report has now become much more detailed, and in fact, much longer. If you take UK company nowadays, since 2013, mostly 14, but it's from 13, you'd see that the auditor report can carry over 5 or 6 pages. Very lengthy. And it provides some information about materiality and some risk areas that they have looked at and some explanation as to what they have done. So this opens up, I think, a rich field. You know, like they discover, the oil and gas companies discover a new oil or gas field and they can extract lots of oil. Same thing. It's a vast area, I think, for research, and I think we can all benefit from that. There are also some limitations and caps to auditor civil liabilities. I think this has sneaked under the radar for many people. I think this is important. So I'll describe some of these changes. I've not researched all these changes. I am in particular interested in the new auditor report, but I'm aware of some other changes, and maybe you in your dissertations, or if you are early career researchers, it's something that you may want to take a look at. Okay, so changes in regulations leave implementation flexibility to a member state. So the EU works in a particular way where you have a directive, but even within a directive that is EU-wide, there is some flexibility as to how it is implemented. So for example, there is a requirement for partner rotation, but they don't say it should be across the board in all member states, say 5 years. They say that each member state has to select the rotation period. So maybe if you say you're interested in partner rotations and whether partner rotations are good or bad, maybe you could look at different requirements and compare and perhaps make some sense of this or take advantage of what this kind of data could tell us. Absent EU regulation, there have been differences such as disclosing the engagement of legal partner identity in the UK has it is available since 2013. It is a more recent requirement elsewhere. Requiring audit firm rotations, we are here in Italy. Italy has required for quite some time firm level rotation. It is still a requirement in place. So Italy has dual mandatory rotation at the firm level as well as the partner level. Okay. Restrictions on provision of non-audit services. Some countries, notably France, do we have anybody here from France? In France, there is no single auditor. They do joint audits. And if I have time, I'll show you some papers that look at it. Is it better to have two auditors than one? So what I am saying is that there is a rich set of differences that can be exploited for research purposes. So partner rotation is required in the EU since 2006. By the way, this is a side comment for people who are based in the UK and want to do UK studies, like myself. Maybe Brexit is going to offer some interesting opportunities. If perhaps leaving the EU also means that certain rules in Britain will change relative to what was done or agreed in the EU. So just watch this space. Maybe there will be some new opportunities. UK 5 years, Italy 6 years, allowed by the directive 7 years. So there are cross-country differences in also cooling off periods. That is, okay, so I rotated the partner, how soon could I bring back the partner? So this cooling off periods. There is the new auditing standard, which is called ISA 700, where the engagement of the partner should be disclosed. In Italy, it has been the case for many years. It is new elsewhere. In the UK, it has been required since 2009. These are the rules for mandatory audit rotations, and I think I want to spend the time left on other things, but you could see that there are various options available. And I list here the rules. It's pretty dry, I don't want to repeat it, but the idea is that there is variety or diversity in application, and maybe that could be a good setting to explore particular questions you're interested in. Okay? The non-audit services restrictions are the new regulation. There will be a cap of maximum 70% of audit fees, and that is a 3-year kind of average. In addition, certain services will be prohibited altogether. What you see is that the current practice varies across countries. Again, something I'm not that familiar with. Just want to point out that there is this regulation. It is new, relatively new regulation, and it may not be the same across all countries, and so one may want to explore the diversity and, of course, the recency of these rules. Here is something that I'm particularly kind of excited about, which is what I mentioned before, that the new auditor report is much more extensive, much richer. And you could do a number of things with that. So, following changes in the UK and international standards of auditing, which is the ISAs, and the 2014 EU regulation, the form and content of the auditor report is changing in the EU, also in the US too. In particular, these two new standards, so revised standards, not sure whether they are new or revised, but these are the numbers that are reported, put forward a new set of requirements. Many standards have been recently revised, and that requires careful analysis. So the second bullet point is to say, while I'm highlighting 700 and 701, this is not to say that this is the only two standards or the only standards that have been revised. My understanding or what I've been reading, my understanding based on what I've been reading, that there are a number of standards, international standards of auditing that have been revised. And while I'm kind of fixated on these two standards, you may want very well to explore what other standards have been revised and whether there is anything that is worth our attention as researchers. Okay? So do not let this kind of mislead you that this is the only thing that has been happening. One particular aspect of the new requirements, which I'm excited about, and I'm not the only one, there has been some research already taking place into what is called key audit matters. Key audit matters. So, for example, if you look at a UK company's financial statements and the auditor report there, you would see that the auditor could highlight several what they call risk areas. Say, we focus, for example, on revenue recognition. And we thought that revenue recognition deserves particular attention, and they explain why. And say, in looking into revenue recognition, we've done this and that. For example, we assessed the estimates used by the company, checked sensitivity to other perhaps inputs, spoke to the managers, consulted outside. They would give quite a long list of things that they have done. So key audit matter, these are matters that in the auditor's professional judgment were of most significance in the audit of the financial statements of the current period. Key audit matters are selected from matters communicated with those charged with governance, namely managers, and in particular the audit committee. Because the committee is the main face, if you will, that the company, or main interaction between the external auditor and the company itself. Guidance as to how the CAMs, the key audit matters, should be identified and communicated in the new report provided there in this ISA. EU regulation now requires the statutory auditor to declare that the prohibited and non-audit services were not provided, so the declaration of what was not done according to the rules. Indicate any services in addition to statutory audit which were provided by the statutory auditor or the audit firm to the audited entity and its controlled undertaking, which have not been disclosed in the management report. So that's lots of rules. The UK has also put forward a stricter set of requirements, which is exciting for us researchers because the auditor report in the UK seems to be much richer. By the way, on a recent visit to the Netherlands, I realized that the Holland is also going in the same way. So it's not only the UK, if I'm entirely fair. So greater detail is to be provided about CAMs, including a summary of the auditor's response to those risks, and I gave you some illustration with an example of revenue recognition, key observations arising with respect to this risk, an explanation of how the auditor applied the concept of materiality. Materiality is a very important concept. If when you teach auditing, you touch on materiality. The innovation now is that in the UK and Netherlands, they will tell you, they give you a number. What is this materiality? What was considered in millions or billions or thousands of pounds or euros as material? that is now perhaps a very or more direct measure of effort. Okay? So, very interesting, I think, and very exciting. And similar requirements in the Netherlands, as I mentioned. And if you want, I know you didn't go to the Python session, but the rich text in these reports, and by the way, there is also audit committee report, which you could triangulate against the auditor report using textual analysis techniques. So that is also something quite exciting that is now possible, perhaps for the first time. Because in the interest of time, I think I have about 4 minutes. I would just quickly say there are some caps to auditor civil liability because regulators are afraid of the case where instead of big 4 we'll have big 3, but they still talk about breaking down these huge beasts. Some differences across EU countries, I'm just skipping it. In the few minutes that I have, I want to just give you examples, and because I do not have time to go into this, I will just mention them almost in passing. This study, Andre et al., looked at whether in France, you may recall, there are 2 auditors, is it working pretty well, and they looked at a sample of 5 years in France and compared it to UK where you don't have this requirement. And what they find that collectively, you just need to take me here for granted, we can talk about it later on in the break if you wanted, but they conclude that the 2 auditors exert more effort than 1, there is no coordination cost and better, but also better opportunity perhaps to extract rent. So that is not so good. They do not find evidence that if both auditors exert more effort, then single audit quality improves. So they have kind of mixed views on what is happening. Zani et al., while in France joint audits are prescribed by law, in Sweden, again taking advantage of what is available in the EU, firms can voluntarily elect to employ joint auditors. Why would you do this? Maybe it's beneficial for them to do this. And so they provide some evidence about this from credit markets on having two auditors, and it's 2 plus 1. Alex, you asked me before about the audit hours. This is the study I referred to, and so you have also the line of hours here, I believe. But they look at some more hours worked, but without pay. So they have various measures. The dependent variable is fees, but hours can seem to be correlated with fees. I didn't mention, maybe I could. So this one is also interesting. Look at the Swedish sample. And they looked at criminal records of auditors. In Sweden, you can know everything about your audit. Do we have anybody from Sweden here? It turns out the authorities in Sweden collect data on everything, tax you pay, all your criminal records. One can know quite a bit about the neighbors, okay? And so this study looked at criminal records of auditors and whether it is associated with poor accounting quality. And they found some evidence consistent with that, which is kind of intriguing. So I think the opportunities to identify interesting, unique research opportunities to Europe. Just learn, open your eyes, open your ears, read more, and you may be able to find interesting opportunities because practice and data vary quite considerably in an interesting way across European countries. So try to come up with perhaps unique research question, or if you want to visit an old research question, but using new data, that is also something pretty exciting. Okay, so I don't have time to do this, but the big data, there are things to think about in the future, which I did not have time to speak about, following up from the previous presentation. So, audit research is vast, still growing, still there are opportunities. There are many research opportunities. For example, I'm also Israeli. I was interested to learn about Israeli context. I hope that the presentation here, you found it intriguing at least, or pointing at some opportunities. And if you want, I'm going to stay behind if you would wish to speak with me or to ask me. By the way, I don't have monopoly over wisdom or anything like that. I'm open to questions and discussions. Thank you very much.